They called her landings too gentle, said she flew like she was afraid to touch the ground. But when 67 refugees needed evacuation from a remote village with nothing but a 200-meter dirt strip and a C-17 Globemaster as their only hope, Captain Esther Baker would prove that sometimes the softest touch can accomplish the impossible. The morning briefing at RAF Brampton began at 0630 sharp, but Captain Esther Baker had been reviewing weather reports and flight plans since 0400. She sat in the back row of the briefing room. Her flight logbook opened to pages filled with meticulous notes about wind patterns, runway conditions, and fuel calculations that went far beyond what was required for routine transport missions. At 26, Esther was one of the youngest pilots in the 99th Airlift Squadron, and certainly the only one who had earned her wings at the Royal Air Force College, Cranwell, after growing up on a small farm in the Cotswolds. Her accent still carried traces of rural Gloucestershire, a soft cadence that somehow reinforced the perception that she was too gentle for the demanding world of military aviation. Squadron leader Marcus Webb stood at the front of the room, his weathered face serious as he outlined the day's missions. Transport runs to Germany, equipment deliveries to training bases, routine flights that kept the squadron busy but rarely challenged anyone's skills. Today's assignments, Webb announced, consulting his tablet. Morrison, you're taking the Berlin Supply Run. Davies, equipment transport to Scotland. Richardson, personnel transport to Cyprus. The names continued, each pilot receiving missions that matched their experience and, more importantly, their perceived capabilities. Esther's pen hovered over her notepad as Webb worked through the list. She'd been with the squadron for 18 months, had logged more flight hours than most pilots her age, and had consistently received excellent ratings on her technical evaluations. But when the challenging assignments came up, the ones requiring precision approaches, difficult weather conditions, or demanding runway situations, she was always passed over. Baker, Webb's voice cut through her thoughts. You're on the Canterbury training circuit. Take the new co-pilots through basic approach procedures. Training circuits, again. Esther nodded curtly, her jaw tight. Around her, the selected pilots, for the more demanding missions, exchanged brief nods of acknowledgement. She might as well have been assigned to count inventory in a warehouse. As the briefing dispersed, she caught fragments of conversation that made her stomach clench with familiar frustration. Good thing Baker's not doing the Cyprus run, Flight Lieutenant James Morrison muttered to his co-pilot. That crosswind approach requires a firm hand. She'd probably float halfway down the runway trying to grease it in. Nothing wrong with smooth landings, Davies replied diplomatically. But there's smooth and there's indecisive. When you're dealing with short runways or emergency situations, you need someone who's not afraid to plant it down hard when necessary. Morrison nodded. Exactly. Baker flies like she's worried about hurting the aircraft's feelings. That's fine for training flights, but in real operational situations, you need a pilot who can make the tough calls. Esther pretended not to hear, but the words stung because they contained a grain of truth wrapped in a fundamental misunderstanding. Yes, her landings were consistently smooth. Yes, she took extra care with aircraft handling. But what her colleagues interpreted as timidity was actually precision, a level of control that came from understanding exactly how much force was needed, and when. The worst part was that their criticism missed the deeper truth about flying. Smoothness wasn't weakness. It was mastery. Every gentle touchdown represented thousands of micro-adjustments, split-second calculations of wind, weight, and physics that most pilots never bothered to perfect. They saw her soft landings as a limitation when they were actually evidence of exceptional skill. After the briefing, Esther walked to the flight line where her assigned Hawk T-2 trainer waited. The aircraft gleamed in the morning sun, its red and white paint scheme marking it clearly as a training aircraft rather than the operational transports and fighters that handled the real missions. She completed her pre-flight inspection with Characteristic thoroughness, checking every surface, every connection, every detail that could affect flight safety. Her instructors at Cranwell had taught her that aviation was unforgiving of shortcuts, and she'd internalized that lesson completely. What none of her squadron mates knew was that Esther spent her off-duty hours pursuing additional training that went far beyond her assigned role. While they relaxed in the officers' mess or took weekend leave, she was studying advanced approach techniques, analyzing landing videos, and practicing scenarios that pushed the boundaries of conventional flying. Her flat in nearby Cambridge was filled with technical manuals, approach charts for airfields around the world, and detailed weather analysis software that she'd purchased with her own money. On her laptop, she maintained spreadsheets tracking runway lengths, approach angles, and environmental factors for hundreds of airfields across Europe and beyond. Every evening after regular flight duties, Esther reviewed footage of challenging landings, aircraft carriers in rough seas, mountain airstrips with severe crosswinds, emergency landings on highways and beaches. She studied how different pilots handled extreme conditions, noting techniques that might be adapted to various aircraft types. Her particular fascination was with short-field operations and extreme precision landings, while her colleagues saw her gentle approach as a limitation. Esther recognized it as the foundation for the kind of control needed in truly demanding situations. Anyone could slam an aircraft onto a long runway, but stopping a C-17 on a short strip required the kind of precise energy management that only came from understanding exactly how softly you could touch down while still maintaining positive control. Training flights she was assigned might have been routine for everyone else, but Esther used them as laboratories for perfecting techniques that weren't in any manual. She practiced spot landings, hitting predetermined points on the runway within meters. She experimented with energy management, finding ways to bleed off speed more efficiently. She developed an intuitive understanding of how different aircraft types responded to varying approach techniques. Her flight logbook told only part of the story. The official entries recorded routine training flights, but her personal notes documented a systematic exploration of aviation's most challenging scenarios. She'd calculated approach angles for theoretical emergency landings, studied the physics of short-field performance, and developed contingency procedures for situations that most pilots hoped they'd never encounter. The irony wasn't lost on her that while Squadron Leader Webb criticized her for lacking operational edge, she was probably the most prepared pilot in the squadron for genuinely difficult flying situations. Her soft touch wasn't evidence of hesitation. It was proof of the kind of control that separated adequate pilots from exceptional ones. During her assigned training flights, Esther often found herself working with newly qualified co-pilots who were eager to learn but had been taught to equate aggressive flying with competent flying. She tried to show them that precision mattered more than force, that understanding your aircraft's capabilities was more valuable than simply overpowering every situation. Feel how the aircraft wants to settle, she'd tell them during approach. Practice. Don't force it down. Guide it to where you want it to be. The aircraft will tell you what it needs if you listen carefully enough. Most of the junior pilots nodded politely, but clearly preferred the more dramatic approaches they'd learned from other instructors. They wanted to feel the excitement of a firm touchdown, the satisfaction of muscling an aircraft exactly where they wanted it. Esther's technique seemed too subtle, too gentle for their image of what military flying should be. What they didn't understand was that she was teaching them skills that might one day save their lives and the lives of others. In truly challenging conditions, short runways, damaged aircraft, emergency situations, the ability to place an aircraft exactly where you wanted it with minimal force could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. But teaching patience and precision to pilots who wanted drama and force was like trying to explain the value of whispers in a world that only respected shouting. Her techniques were dismissed as too careful, too conservative. too concerned with perfection when what was needed was decisive action. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The pattern had been established within weeks of Esther's arrival at RAF Brampton, though it took her months to recognize it fully. Every time a mission required anything beyond routine transport duties, she found herself assigned to training. Flights, maintenance checks, or administrative tasks. When the squadron was tasked with delivering humanitarian supplies to a flood-damaged region in the Netherlands, where the temporary airstrip had challenging crosswind conditions, Squadron Leader Webb assigned the mission to Flight Lieutenant Davies. Davies has experience with difficult approach conditions, Webb explained during the briefing. Though Esther had logged more instrument flying hours than Davies in the past 6 months, the mission to transport critical medical equipment to a remote airbase in northern Scotland, where the runway had length restrictions and required precise weight calculations, went to Morrison. Morrison knows how to handle weight-critical missions, Webb announced. Despite the fact that Esther had consistently demonstrated superior performance in aircraft performance calculations during their regular evaluations, each exclusion came with a reasonable explanation. Davies had seniority. Morrison had previous experience with that particular route. Richardson had better familiarity with international protocols. But Esther began to notice that the criteria for mission selection seemed to shift depending on who was being considered. When experience mattered, pilots with more years of service were chosen. When technical skill was emphasized, pilots with different specializations were selected. When familiarity with specific routes was important, anyone who had flown those routes before took precedence. The one constant was that Esther's particular combination of skills, her precision, her meticulous preparation, her gentle but controlled flying technique, never seemed to be exactly what any mission required. The most painful exclusion came when the squadron was assigned to support a joint training exercise with the German Air Force. The mission involved multiple challenging approaches to different airfields, some with short runways, others with complex approach patterns that demanded precise flying. Esther had studied those German airfields extensively as part of her personal training regimen and knew the approach procedures better than anyone in the squadron. Richardson will lead the German exercise flights, Webb announced. He's got good experience with international operations. Richardson nodded with professional satisfaction, though Esther knew he'd never flown to any of the assigned German airfields and would need to spend days studying approach charts that she had already memorized. After the briefing, Esther approached Webb's office, her preparation materials in hand. She knocked on the doorframe and waited for permission to enter. "Sir, regarding the German exercise missions," she began carefully. "I've been studying those particular airfields for several months as part of my professional development. I'm familiar with the approach procedures and could provide valuable support for the mission planning." Webb looked up from his paperwork, his expression polite but dismissive. "I appreciate your enthusiasm, Baker, but Richardson has the international experience we need for this type of operation. Your time would be better spent focusing on your assigned training duties. With respect, sir, I have the approach charts memorized for all 6 German airfields. I've analyzed the weather patterns, calculated the performance requirements, and studied the air traffic control procedures. I believe I could contribute significantly to mission success." Webb's expression shifted slightly, showing the first hint of irritation. "Baker, mission assignments are based on overall operational requirements, not just technical knowledge. Richardson brings leadership experience and proven performance in complex international environments." Esther felt the familiar frustration building but kept her voice steady. "I understand, sir. I was simply offering my expertise to support the mission in whatever capacity would be most valuable." "Your expertise," Webb replied, "is in training operations and routine flights. That's where you're most effective, and that's where you're needed. The dismissal was clear, though delivered with professional courtesy. As Esther left Webb's office, she reflected on the circular logic that kept her trapped in routine assignments. She couldn't gain experience with challenging missions because she lacked experience with challenging missions. She couldn't demonstrate her capabilities in demanding situations because she was never given access to demanding situations. The German exercise missions proceeded without her, and Richardson performed adequately, though post-mission reports noted several approach inconsistencies that could have been avoided with better preparation. Esther read the reports with a mixture of vindication and frustration. She could have prevented those problems, but she'd never been given the chance. The pattern extended beyond just mission assignments. When the squadron discussed new procedures or evaluated potential improvements to their operations, Esther's suggestions were listened to politely but rarely implemented. Her ideas were characterized as interesting or worth considering. Diplomatic. Phrases that meant they would be filed away and forgotten. During monthly performance reviews, Webb consistently praised her technical competence and professional demeanor, while noting that she needed to develop more operational confidence and decisive leadership qualities. The feedback created an impossible catch-22. She couldn't develop operational confidence without operational experience, and she couldn't gain operational experience without first demonstrating operational confidence. The breaking point in terms of open criticism came during a routine squadron social event at the officers' mess. Esther had arrived early, hoping to engage in more casual conversation with her colleagues, perhaps building the kind of relationships that might lead to better mission opportunities. She found herself standing near a group of pilots discussing a recent training exercise, where one of the newer co-pilots had struggled with crosswind landings. The conversation started professionally, but gradually shifted toward more personal assessments of flying styles within the squadron. The problem with these new pilots, Morrison was saying, gesturing with his pint of beer, is they're not taught to be aggressive enough. They want to massage every landing instead of just getting the aircraft on the ground. Exactly, Davies agreed. Sometimes you need to just plant it down and deal with the consequences. Trying to grease every landing makes you hesitant in situations where decisiveness matters. Richardson nodded thoughtfully. Speaking of which, have you noticed how Baker lands? I swear she's afraid to actually make contact with the runway. Every approach is like she's trying to set down a soap bubble. The comment drew chuckles from the group, and Morrison seized the opportunity to expand on the theme. Oh God, yes. I was behind her in the pattern last month, and she floated for what felt like half the runway length, trying to get the perfect touchdown. In a real operational scenario, that kind of hesitation could be catastrophic. It's not just the landings. Davies added, it's the whole approach to flying. Everything's so careful, so calculated. Sometimes you need pilots who can make quick decisions and commit to them, not spend 5 minutes analyzing every variable. Esther stood frozen, her drink untouched in her hand. She was close enough to hear every word clearly, but positioned so that the speakers couldn't see her directly. The casual cruelty of their assessment was made worse by its fundamental misunderstanding of what they were observing. Richardson continued the critique. I mean, there's nothing wrong with precise flying, but military aviation isn't about perfect technique in ideal conditions. It's about getting the job done when everything's going wrong. Baker's style might work fine for civilian flying, but in operational situations, you need someone who's not afraid to be rough when roughness is required. The thing is, Morrison said, warming to his theme, she's technically competent. Her procedures are flawless, her knowledge is excellent, her aircraft handling is textbook perfect. But that's exactly the problem. Real flying isn't textbook perfect. Real flying is messy and demanding, and sometimes requires you to push limits that the textbook says you shouldn't push. Davies raised his glass in a mock toast. Here's to pilots who know when to throw the manual out the window and just get the job done. The group drank to the sentiment, and Esther felt something cold settle in her stomach. Everything they were saying demonstrated a complete misunderstanding of advanced flying techniques. Her floating landings weren't evidence of hesitation. They were evidence of precise energy management that allowed her to place the aircraft exactly where she wanted it. Her careful approach wasn't timidity. It was the kind of control that became essential in genuinely challenging situations, but explaining that would only reinforce their perception that she was too academic, too theoretical, too concerned with perfection to handle real-world flying demands. They wanted to see drama and force, and they interpreted her precision as weakness. "You know what Baker needs?" Richardson said, his voice carrying the authority of someone proposing a solution. "She needs to spend some time with pilots who'll teach her that sometimes good enough is better than perfect. Sometimes you just need to get the aircraft on the ground and worry about elegance later." Morrison laughed. "Good luck with that." She'd probably want to calculate the optimal approach angle for teaching her to be less careful. The conversation gradually shifted to other topics, but Esther remained standing in the same spot, processing what she'd heard. Her colleagues weren't just questioning her flying technique. They were questioning her fundamental approach to aviation. They saw her precision as a character flaw, her preparation as excessive, her careful technique as evidence of inadequate confidence. She left the officer's mess without finishing her drink, walking back to her quarters through the evening air. The worst part wasn't the personal criticism. She developed thick skin for that. The worst part was realizing that her very strengths were being interpreted as weaknesses, that the skills she'd worked hardest to develop were seen as liabilities by the people who controlled her career advancement. That night, alone in her quarters, Esther made a decision that would define the next phase of her career. If her colleagues couldn't recognize the value of precision flying, she would develop those skills to such an extraordinary level that they would become impossible to ignore. She began by expanding her personal training regimen far beyond anything expected of a squadron pilot. Using her personal funds, she enrolled in advanced civilian courses that the RAF didn't offer: mountain flying techniques, emergency landing procedures, and extreme short-field operations. Every weekend and leave period became an opportunity to push her skills into areas that most military pilots never explored. Her first major investment was in flight simulator time at a civilian facility in London. The simulators there could replicate conditions that no training program would safely attempt: approaches to damaged runways, landings with significant aircraft malfunctions, and operations in weather conditions that grounded most aircraft. Esther spent hours practicing scenarios that other pilots hoped they would never encounter. The simulator sessions revealed something remarkable: her gentle approach style, which her colleagues criticized as overly cautious, was actually ideal for the most challenging flying situations. When dealing with damaged aircraft or severely restricted landing areas, the ability to place an aircraft precisely where you wanted it with minimal force wasn't just helpful. It was essential. She began documenting her training in a private logbook that recorded not just flight hours but specific techniques mastered and scenarios successfully completed. The entries read like a graduate course in advanced aviation: completed simulated approach to 300-meter runway with 20-knot crosswind component, successfully executed emergency landing simulation with hydraulic failure and partial flap deployment, mastered energy management for minimum distance landings in transport category aircraft. Her study of international airfields expanded from general knowledge to operational expertise. She memorized approach procedures for airfields across Africa, Asia, and remote regions of Europe where runway conditions were marginal and navigation aids were limited. She studied the performance characteristics of every aircraft type in RAF service, calculating takeoff and landing distances for various weight configurations and environmental conditions. The most significant addition to her training was helicopter time. Esther realized that rotary wing flying required the kind of precise control and gentle touch that she naturally possessed. Fixed-wing pilots often struggled with helicopter training because they tried to apply the same forceful techniques that worked with airplanes. Esther's precise approach translated perfectly to helicopter operations. She earned her helicopter license during leave periods, funding the training entirely from her personal savings. The helicopter instructor, a former RAF pilot named Captain James Morrison, no relation to her squadron colleague, recognized her exceptional spatial awareness and control immediately. Most fixed-wing pilots want to muscle the helicopter into position, Morrison told her during one training session. You understand that it's about finesse. You're not fighting the aircraft, you're working with it. That's a rare quality. The helicopter training reinforced Esther's understanding that precision and gentleness were advanced flying skills, not basic ones. Helicopter operations required exactly the kind of soft touch that her colleagues criticized in her fixed-wing flying. The ability to make micro-adjustments, to control power and attitude with extreme subtlety, to place an aircraft exactly where you wanted it without overshoot or correction. These were graduate-level piloting skills. Meanwhile, at RAF Brampton, Esther maintained her assigned duties with characteristic excellence, while quietly building capabilities that far exceeded anything required for routine transport operations. She volunteered for additional training opportunities, studied international aviation regulations during her free time, and maintained currency in aircraft types that weren't part of her normal duties. Her flight gear bag contained equipment that most transport pilots didn't carry: detailed approach charts for remote airfields, emergency procedure cards for various aircraft types, and communication equipment that could operate on international frequencies. She was prepared for flying opportunities that didn't exist in her current assignment but might arise unexpectedly. The irony was that while Squadron Leader Webb criticized her for lacking operational edge, she was probably the most operationally prepared pilot in the squadron. Her training had taken her far beyond the requirements of routine military transport, flying into areas that few pilots ever explored. She could land aircraft on strips that others would declare impossible, navigate in conditions that would ground most flights, and handle emergencies that weren't covered in standard training programs. But all of this preparation remained invisible to her colleagues because they never gave her opportunities to demonstrate these capabilities. Her gentle flying style continued to be interpreted as lack of confidence rather than evidence of advanced skill. Her extensive preparation was seen as excessive rather than thorough. The first sign that Esther's dedication was being viewed with suspicion rather than admiration came during a routine equipment inspection. Flight Sergeant Patricia Williams, the squadron's senior maintenance coordinator, approached Esther's personal flight gear with unusual interest. "Quite a collection of charts you've got here, Captain," Williams remarked, flipping through Esther's approach plates for airfields across 3 continents. "Most pilots carry maybe a dozen charts for regular routes. You've got, what, over 200 here?" Esther tried to keep her voice casual. "I like to be prepared for different scenarios. You never know when you might need to divert to an alternate airfield." Williams raised an eyebrow. "Alternate airfields in Afghanistan? South Sudan? These aren't exactly standard RAF destinations." She continued examining the charts, noting the detailed annotations and performance calculations that Esther had made. "For each location, it's professional development," Esther explained. "Understanding different operational environments helps improve overall flying skills." "Professional development," Williams repeated slowly. "For missions you're not assigned to, in regions where we don't operate." The skepticism in her voice was unmistakable. Word of Esther's extensive chart collection spread through the squadron with the efficiency that only military gossip could achieve. By the next morning, pilots were making jokes about Baker's world. tour planning, and speculating about why someone would need approach information for remote airfields in conflict zones. The jokes took on a more pointed edge during the weekly flight planning meeting. As pilots discussed upcoming missions and route planning, Morrison made a casual comment that landed like a thrown stone. "If anyone needs obscure airfield information, just ask Baker. Apparently, she's got approach charts for places the rest of us have never heard of." Davies laughed. "Maybe she's planning her post-military career as an adventure pilot. Although I'm not sure her landing style would work well on those rough African strips." Squadron Leader Webb, who had been reviewing fuel calculations, looked up with interest. "What's this about charts?" "Oh, nothing important, sir," Morrison replied quickly. "Just noted that Baker's got quite an extensive collection of international approach plates. More than most of us carry for regular operations." Webb's expression shifted to something more serious. "How extensive?" "Couple hundred charts for airfields worldwide," Williams interjected, "including some pretty remote locations and non-standard operational areas." Webb made a note on his planning board. "Baker, see me after this meeting." The conference room fell silent. Esther felt every eye in the room focused on her, but not with admiration or curiosity. The looks carried suspicion, as if her preparation had revealed something inappropriate about her intentions or loyalty. After the meeting, Webb's office felt smaller than usual. He sat behind his desk with Esther's personnel file open, his expression unreadable. "Captain Baker, there have been some questions raised about your extracurricular interests, sir. Your collection of approach charts, your study of airfields in regions where we don't operate, your extensive training and procedures that aren't part of your assigned duties." Webb leaned back in his chair. "I need to understand what you're preparing for." Esther chose her words carefully. "Sir, I believe that comprehensive preparation makes me a better pilot and a more valuable asset to the squadron. Understanding different operational environments and aircraft capabilities enhances my ability to contribute to any mission." "But you're not assigned to missions requiring that level of specialized knowledge," Webb pointed out. "Your duties are primarily training flights and routine transport operations. Why are you investing time and energy in capabilities you're not expected to use?" "Because those capabilities might become necessary unexpectedly, sir. Emergency situations don't always respect normal operational boundaries." Webb's expression suggested he wasn't entirely satisfied with that explanation. "Captain, there's a difference between being prepared and being unfocused. Military effectiveness requires pilots who can excel within their assigned roles, not pilots who are distracted by responsibilities outside their area of expertise." "I haven't neglected any of my assigned duties, sir. My performance evaluations have been consistently excellent." "That's not the issue," Webb replied. "The issue is resource allocation and operational focus. Time spent studying procedures you're not authorized to use is time not spent perfecting the skills you are expected to demonstrate." Esther felt the familiar frustration building. "Sir, with respect, wouldn't a pilot with broader capabilities be more valuable to the squadron than one with narrow expertise?" "Not necessarily," Webb said firmly. "Broad capabilities without corresponding experience can actually be dangerous. A pilot who thinks they know how to handle situations they've never actually encountered can make poor decisions that put aircraft and crew at risk." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, but the essential message was clear. Esther's extensive preparation was being interpreted as evidence of poor judgment rather than exceptional dedication. Her readiness for challenges outside her normal duties was seen as distraction from her assigned role rather than enhancement of her overall value. 3 weeks after the chart incident, Squadron Leader Webb called Esther into his office for what he termed a career development discussion. The meeting was scheduled for 1400 hours on a Thursday afternoon, deliberately timed to avoid the casual atmosphere of morning briefings or end of day. Conversations. Esther entered the office to find Webb seated behind his desk with her complete personnel file spread before him. Also present was Wing Commander Sarah Mitchell from Base Personnel, her expression professional but stern. The formal nature of the meeting was immediately clear. "Captain Baker," Webb began, "we need to discuss your career trajectory and operational focus within this squadron." Esther remained standing until invited to sit, recognizing the gravity of the moment. "Yes, sir. Your technical competence has never been in question," Webb continued. "Your flight evaluations are consistently excellent. Your procedural knowledge is comprehensive, and your safety record is exemplary. However, there are concerns about your professional focus and career expectations." Wing Commander Mitchell leaned forward, consulting her own notes. "Captain, your training records show extensive civilian instruction in areas well outside normal RAF requirements, helicopter certification, mountain flying techniques, emergency procedures for aircraft types you're not authorized to operate. Can you explain this pattern of extracurricular development?" Esther had rehearsed this conversation in her mind dozens of times, but facing the actual moment felt different than any preparation could address. "Ma'am, I believe that comprehensive training makes me a better pilot and a more valuable asset to the RAF. The skills I've developed enhance my ability to contribute to squadron operations." "But you're not assigned to operations requiring those skills," Webb interjected. "Your duties are training flights, routine transport missions, and logistical support. Why are you investing significant time and personal resources and capabilities that aren't part of your job description?" "Because exceptional situations require exceptional preparation, sir. Emergency conditions don't respect normal operational boundaries." Mitchell's expression suggested skepticism. "Captain, there's a difference between being prepared and having unrealistic expectations about your role within the squadron. Military effectiveness requires officers who can excel within their assigned duties, not officers who are distracted by ambitions beyond their current capabilities." The word ambitions carried a weight that made Esther's chest tighten. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand what you mean by unrealistic expectations," Webb answered for Mitchell. "Captain, your performance in assigned duties has been adequate, but your focus seems to be on preparing for missions you're not qualified to undertake. Your flying style, while technically proficient, lacks the decisiveness required for challenging operational scenarios." "What specific aspects of my flying style are considered inadequate, sir?" "Your approach to landings, for one thing," Webb replied. "Every touchdown is so focused on smoothness that you sacrifice the kind of positive control needed in demanding conditions. Military flying isn't about perfect technique. It's about getting the job done efficiently and safely." Esther felt heat rising in her cheeks. "Sir, respectfully, precise landings aren't evidence of inadequate control. They demonstrate the kind of energy management that becomes essential in truly challenging situations. Challenging situations require decisive action, not extended analysis," Mitchell added. "The feedback from other pilots suggests that your flying style is too hesitant for operational demands." "Other pilots?" Esther couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. Webb consulted his notes. "Multiple squadron members have expressed concerns about your approach to flying. The consensus is that while you're technically competent, you lack the operational confidence needed for demanding missions." Esther realized that the casual conversation she'd overheard, the dismissive comments about her landing technique, had been formalized into official feedback that was now part of her personnel record. Her colleagues' misunderstanding of her precision had become institutional policy. "Sir, with respect, I believe there's been a fundamental misinterpretation of my flying capabilities. What's been characterized as hesitation is actually advanced technique. The precision that's been criticized as excessive is exactly what's needed for genuinely challenging flying situations." Mitchell and Webb exchanged glances. Mitchell spoke first. "Captain, this is exactly the kind of thinking that concerns us." You're defending techniques that experienced pilots have identified as problematic, rather than accepting feedback and working to improve. I'm trying to explain that the feedback is based on a misunderstanding of advanced flying principles. Ma'am, and that attitude, Webb said firmly, is precisely the problem. Military aviation requires pilots who can accept guidance from experienced commanders, not pilots who think they know better than their supervisors and colleagues. The conversation had reached a point where Esther realized that further explanation would only reinforce their perception that she was argumentative and unwilling to accept legitimate criticism. She was trapped in a situation where her expertise was being used as evidence against her competence. "Captain Baker," Mitchell said, her tone taking on the formality of official policy. "Effective immediately, you're being assigned exclusively to training duties and routine transport operations. No exceptions, no special requests for additional missions. Your focus needs to be on mastering your assigned role rather than pursuing capabilities outside your area of responsibility." Additionally, Webb added, your personal training activities need to be approved in advance by squadron leadership. We need to ensure that your professional development aligns with squadron needs rather than personal interests. Esther stared at them both, processing the magnitude of what had just happened. She was being formally restricted to the most basic flying duties, prevented from pursuing the very training that made her exceptional, and required to seek permission for the professional development that had always been her personal responsibility. "Do you understand these directives, Captain?" Mitchell asked. "Yes, ma'am," Esther replied, though understanding and accepting were entirely different things. "Good. We expect to see renewed focus on your assigned duties and less attention to extraneous activities. Your next performance review will specifically evaluate your commitment to squadron priorities versus personal projects." As Esther left the office, she realized that her career had just been formally constrained within boundaries that would prevent her from ever demonstrating her true capabilities. She'd been defined by other people's limitations and trapped within their understanding of what she should be allowed to attempt. The emergency call came through at 11:47 hours on a Tuesday morning that had started like any other. Esther was reviewing training schedules in the Squadron Operations Center when the communications specialist, Corporal Lewis, suddenly straightened at his radio console. "Sir," Lewis called to Squadron Leader Webb, "we're receiving an emergency transmission from Médecins Sans Frontières in Chad. They've got a medical evacuation request, critical priority." Webb hurried to the communications station, and Esther found herself drawn by the urgency in Lewis's voice. Through the radio static, a desperate voice with a French accent was transmitting coordinates and medical details. "This is Dr. Marie Dubois at the Fata Field Clinic. We have 67 refugees with severe cholera outbreak, including 19 children under age 5. We need immediate medical evacuation to N'Djamena Hospital. Local transport is impossible due to rebel activity in the region." Webb grabbed the microphone. "Dr. Dubois, this is Squadron Leader Webb, RAF Brampton. What are your airfield conditions?" "The only landing area is a dirt strip, approximately 200 meters long, maybe 250 at most. No navigation aids, no ground support equipment. But it's our only option. The road to N'Djamena has been cut by fighting." Esther felt her pulse quicken. She knew about that airstrip from her extensive study of African airfields. It was designated as an emergency landing area only, never intended for large aircraft operations. The approach was complicated by surrounding terrain and unpredictable wind conditions. Webb was already consulting flight planning charts. "Dr. Dubois, we'll need to assess the feasibility of landing a transport aircraft at your location." "What's the current weather?" "Clear skies, light winds, but the strip is rough ground with minimal preparation. We've marked the edges with whatever materials we could find." Webb turned to the gathered pilots who had assembled around the communications console. "Gentlemen, I need options. Who's familiar with this type of operation? Morrison stepped forward. Sir, 200 meters is marginal for any of our transport aircraft. A Hercules might be possible with perfect conditions, but it would be extremely risky. What about a C-17? Webb asked. Davies shook his head. Sir, a Globemaster needs at least 600 meters for safe operations, more with reduced runway conditions. 200 meters would be impossible. Richardson consulted his flight planning guide. The performance charts don't even cover landing distances that short for transport category aircraft. We'd need helicopter support, but the range to Chad exceeds our helicopter capabilities. Esther watched the discussion with growing frustration. She knew that what they were saying was technically correct, according to standard operating procedures, but it didn't account for advanced short field techniques that could dramatically reduce landing distances. Webb was making calculations on his planning board. The nearest suitable airfield is over 300 kilometers from the refugee camp. Even if we could arrange ground transport, it would take days to move 67 sick people through territory with active fighting. Sir, Morrison said. Carefully, I don't think we have any realistic options. The physics just don't work for landing a large transport aircraft on a 200-meter dirt strip. Dr. Dubois's voice crackled through the radio again, more desperate now. RAF Brampton, please respond. We're losing patients every hour. Without immediate evacuation, we could lose 30 or 40 people, mostly children. The room fell silent, except for the static of radio transmission. Esther looked around at her colleagues, all of whom were staring at planning charts and shaking their heads. They were good pilots, competent and professional, but they were thinking within the boundaries of conventional operations. Sir, Esther said quietly, stepping forward from where she'd been standing near the back of the group. Webb looked up with an expression that suggested he'd forgotten she was present. Yes, Baker? I believe a C-17 could land on that strip. The room erupted in disbelief. Morrison turned to stare at her. Baker, a Globemaster has a minimum landing distance of over 1,500 feet in ideal conditions. 200 meters is barely 600 feet. In standard configurations with standard techniques, Esther replied. But with advanced energy management and precision approach control, the landing distance can be reduced significantly. Davies laughed, though not unkindly. Baker, this isn't a flight simulator. Real aircraft have real physics limitations that you can't overcome with precise flying. I've studied the performance characteristics extensively. Esther continued, her voice steady despite the skepticism around her. With proper approach angle, optimal energy management, and precise touchdown control, a C-17 can stop in much less distance than standard charts indicate. Webb's expression was a mixture of disbelief and irritation. Captain Baker, this is not the time for theoretical discussions. We're dealing with a life-and-death situation that requires realistic solutions. Sir, this is a realistic solution. I've calculated the approach parameters, studied the airfield conditions, and developed the techniques necessary to make it work. Richardson shook his head. Even if the landing were possible, which it isn't, the takeoff would be impossible. You'd never get a loaded C-17 off the ground in 200 meters. The takeoff would be challenging but manageable with reduced fuel load and optimal weight distribution, Esther replied. The key is energy management and understanding exactly how much performance you can extract from the aircraft. Morrison stepped closer, his voice carrying the tone of someone explaining reality to a child. Baker, I appreciate your confidence, but what you're describing is fantasy. Transport aircraft don't land on strips that short because it's physically impossible. Not because we haven't tried hard enough. Squadron Leader Webb stared at Esther for a long moment, his expression cycling through disbelief, frustration, and something that might have been consideration. Around them, the operations center buzzed with the tension of an emergency that seemed to have no solution. "Captain Baker," Webb said finally, "are you seriously suggesting that you could land a C-17 Globemaster on a 200-meter dirt strip in Chad?" "Yes, sir," Esther replied without hesitation. "With proper preparation and technique, it's feasible." The radio crackled again with Dr. Dubois's increasingly desperate voice. "RAF Brampton, we need an immediate response. Patient conditions are deteriorating rapidly. Please confirm if evacuation is possible." Webb grabbed the microphone. "Dr. Dubois, we're evaluating options. Stand by." He turned back to the assembled pilots, his expression grim. "Gentlemen, I need realistic assessments. Is there any possibility that Captain Baker's proposal could work?" Morrison was the first to respond. "Sir, with all due respect to Captain Baker's enthusiasm, what she's suggesting violates every principle of safe transport aircraft operation. The performance margins simply don't exist. The approach would be suicidal," Davies added. "Even if you could somehow get the aircraft stopped on the ground, the stresses on the landing gear and aircraft structure would likely cause catastrophic failure." Richardson nodded in agreement. "Sir, I've flown C-17s for 8 years. The aircraft wasn't designed for this type of operation. The risk of losing both the aircraft and crew would be unacceptable." Webb looked around the room, seeking any dissenting opinion. Anyone else have thoughts on this proposal? Flight Sergeant Williams, who had been quietly reviewing technical manuals, looked up from her calculations. "Sir, the book says minimum landing distance for a C-17 is 3,000 feet on prepared surfaces. Even with perfect conditions, I can't see how you'd cut that to 600 feet. Esther felt the familiar frustration building, but this time it was different. This time, people were dying while her colleagues debated limitations that existed more in their minds than in physical reality. "Sir," she said, stepping forward with her personal flight planning materials, "I've been studying extreme short field operations for 2 years. I have detailed calculations showing how energy management techniques can reduce landing distances far below standard charts." Webb glanced at her materials but didn't examine them closely. "Captain, your theoretical studies are admirable, but we're dealing with a real-world emergency. I can't risk a multi-million-pound aircraft and experienced crew on untested theories. They're not theories, sir. They're proven techniques that have been demonstrated in civilian applications." "The physics are sound," Morrison interrupted. "Baker, there's a difference between civilian bush flying and military transport operations. The aircraft types, weights, and operational requirements are completely different. The principles of energy management are the same regardless of aircraft type," Esther replied. "A C-17 is actually better suited for short-field operations than many smaller aircraft because of its advanced flight control systems and powerful reverse thrust capability." Davies shook his head. "Even if the landing were somehow possible, the psychological stress of attempting something that dangerous would compromise decision-making. In emergency situations, you need pilots who can execute proven procedures, not experimental techniques." Webb was running out of options, and everyone in the room knew it. The radio continued to broadcast increasingly desperate updates from Chad, and no conventional solutions existed for reaching the refugees in time. "Sir," Esther said, her voice carrying new urgency, "while we're debating theoretical limitations, people are dying. I have the skills and knowledge necessary to attempt this mission. Even if the odds aren't perfect, shouldn't we try to save those lives?" "Captain Baker," Webb replied, his tone taking on the formality of official policy, "I cannot authorize a mission that has such a high probability of failure. The risk to aircraft and crew is unacceptable. What about the risk to 67 refugees who will die without our help?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Webb stared at Esther, clearly struggling with the competing demands of military protocol and humanitarian necessity. Richardson filled the silence. "Sir, there has to be another solution. Maybe we could coordinate with French forces in the region, or arrange for multiple helicopter lifts from a closer base. Lewis, monitoring communications, shook his head. Sir, I've been checking with regional commands. French forces are dealing with their own emergency situations, and no helicopter assets are available with sufficient range and capacity. Morrison tried a different approach. What about airdropping medical supplies instead of attempting evacuation? We could at least provide immediate treatment materials. Dr. Dubois has already indicated that field treatment isn't sufficient. Webb replied, These patients need hospital-level care that's only available in N'Djamena. Esther watched her colleagues exhaust every alternative except the one that might actually work. Their dismissal of her proposal wasn't based on careful analysis of her capabilities. It was based on their predetermined assumptions about what was possible. Sir, she said finally, I understand the risks involved. But I also understand that conventional thinking isn't going to save those people. Sometimes exceptional situations require exceptional responses. Webb studied her with an expression that mixed professional concern with personal frustration. Captain Baker, even if I believed your assessment of the aircraft's capabilities, which I don't, I cannot authorize a mission based on untested techniques. Military aviation requires proven procedures, not experimental flying. Then people are going to die while we follow procedures, Esther replied, her voice steady despite the emotion building inside her. That's not your decision to make, Captain, Webb said firmly. Mission authorization is my responsibility, and I'm not willing to risk additional lives on what amounts to an aviation stunt. The word stunt landed like a slap. Everything Esther had worked for, all her preparation and study and dedication, reduced to showboating. She stared at Webb, then at her colleagues, all of whom were nodding in agreement with his assessment. Dr. Dubois's voice came through the radio one more time, weaker now and filled with resignation. A RAF Brampton, if evacuation is not possible, please advise, we need to make arrangements for other measures. Other measures. Esther knew what that meant, preparing for mass casualties, digging graves, watching children die from preventable causes because the people with the capability to help were too constrained by convention to act. That evening, as the base settled into its routine quiet, Esther sat in her quarters staring at the detailed approach charts she'd prepared for the Chad airstrip. The calculations were precise, the technique was sound, and she knew with absolute certainty that the mission was possible. Difficult, demanding, risky, but possible. Outside her window, she could see the C-17 Globemaster sitting on the tarmac, fully fueled and equipped for long-range operations. The aircraft was scheduled for a routine training flight the next morning, which meant it would be ready for immediate departure if needed. At 2,130 hours, Esther made a decision that would define the rest of her career. She began assembling the equipment and documentation needed for an unauthorized humanitarian mission to Chad. Her personal flight bag contained everything necessary: detailed approach charts for the refugee camp airstrip, performance calculations for short field operations, emergency medical protocols, and navigation equipment for operations in regions without standard air traffic control. She'd been preparing for this exact scenario for months without knowing it. The most challenging aspect would be accessing the aircraft without triggering security protocols. Esther had studied base security procedures as thoroughly as she'd studied flying techniques, and she knew that routine maintenance checks provided windows of opportunity for someone with legitimate access credentials. At 2,300 hours, she made her way to the flight line through maintenance corridors that she'd mapped during her extensive base familiarization. The night shift crew was focused on scheduled maintenance tasks, and her presence in the area wouldn't immediately raise questions. She approached the C-17 with the confident stride of someone conducting routine pre-flight preparations. Her maintenance Credentials provided access to the aircraft, and her knowledge of systems allowed her to complete startup procedures without assistance. The most critical moment came when she needed to contact air traffic control for departure clearance. Esther had prepared for this by filing a false flight plan earlier in the day, listing a routine training mission to a German airbase. The plan was realistic enough to pass initial scrutiny, but flexible enough to allow for route changes once. Airborne. Tower, this is ASCOT 457 requesting immediate departure clearance for filed training mission. She transmitted, using standard procedures that would sound routine to the controller. ASCOT 457. Cleared for takeoff runway 27. Contact departure control passing 3,000 feet. The C-17's 4 Pratt & Whitney turbofan engines spooled up with a sound that Esther had heard thousands of times but never from the pilot's seat of an unauthorized mission. As the aircraft accelerated down the runway, she felt a mixture of exhilaration and terror that she'd never experienced in any legal flight. Once airborne and clear of British airspace, Esther transmitted a message that would end her military career and possibly save 67 lives. RAF Brampton operations. This is Captain Esther Baker in ASCOT 457. I am proceeding to Chad for humanitarian evacuation mission. Estimated arrival at refugee camp 0630 local time. The radio response was immediate and furious. ASCOT 457. You are ordered to return to base immediately. You are not authorized for international operations. RAF Brampton, negative on return. To base, proceeding with medical evacuation as discussed. Lives are at stake. Captain Baker, you are directly violating orders and operating outside your authority. Return to base immediately or face court-martial. Esther switched to international emergency frequencies and began coordinating with Dr. Dubois, who responded with desperate relief when she explained that evacuation was proceeding. The flight to Chad took 4 hours through the darkness over France, the Mediterranean, and the Sahara Desert. Esther used the time to review her approach calculations one final time and to prepare mentally for what would either be the most challenging landing of her career or her final attempt at flying anything. As dawn broke over the African landscape, she could see the refugee camp ahead, a cluster of temporary structures, surrounding a dirt strip that looked even shorter and rougher than the aerial photographs had suggested. But she'd prepared for this moment for 2 years, had calculated every variable, had developed the techniques necessary to make the impossible routine. Dr. Dubois's voice crackled over the emergency radio frequency. British aircraft, we can see you approaching. The landing area is as clear as we can make it. Wind is calm, visibility unlimited. Esther began her approach to a landing that would either prove her capabilities beyond question or end her career in catastrophic failure. Either way, she would finally discover whether her years of preparation and her gentle touch could accomplish what conventional wisdom declared impossible. The approach to the refugee camp airstrip demanded everything Esther had learned about precision flying. At 3,000 feet above the ground, she could see the full challenge, a rough dirt strip barely 200 meters long, surrounded by scattered rocks, and emergency shelters with people gathered at both ends marking the landing area with whatever materials they could find. Dr. Dubois's voice guided her through the radio. British aircraft. The strip runs east to west. We've cleared the approach path as much as possible, but there are some obstacles about 50 meters from the eastern threshold. Esther began configuring the C-17 for the most aggressive short-field approach she'd ever attempted. Full flaps. Landing gear down early to increase drag. Engines set for maximum reverse thrust capability upon touchdown. Every system on the aircraft was optimized for minimum landing distance. Dr. Dubois, I need you to confirm wind conditions and have all personnel clear of the landing area, Esther transmitted. This approach will require precise energy management, and I can't afford any distractions. Understood. Wind is calm. less than 5 knots from the east. All personnel are clear, except for medical teams standing by for immediate patient loading. The key to the landing would be energy management, bringing the aircraft down at the steepest possible angle while maintaining precise control over speed and touchdown point. Esther had calculated that she needed to cross the threshold at exactly 115 knots, touch down within the first 50 meters of the strip, and achieve maximum braking immediately upon contact. At 1,000 feet. She established the approach angle, nearly twice as steep as normal C-17 operations. The aircraft felt different in this configuration, responding to control inputs with the sensitivity that came from operating at the edge of its performance envelope. 500 feet, she announced to herself, monitoring airspeed and descent rate with obsessive precision. The strip ahead looked impossibly short, a narrow scar of packed earth that seemed to shrink with every second of descent. At 200 feet, Esther made the final commitment to landing. The approach was stabilized. The aircraft was responding exactly as her calculations had predicted, and the touchdown zone was clearly defined ahead. She'd either proven her theories correct or discovered their fatal flaws in the next 30 seconds. The touchdown came exactly where she'd planned it, 40 meters past the eastern threshold, with the gentlest contact she'd ever achieved under such demanding conditions. But gentleness was only the beginning of the challenge. Now she had to stop 200,000 pounds of aircraft in less than 160 meters of remaining runway. Maximum. Reverse thrust engaged immediately, the 4 engines screaming as they redirected their power to decelerate the aircraft. Wheel brakes applied progressively to avoid skidding on the unprepared surface. Every technique she'd studied, every procedure she'd practiced, came together in a symphony of controlled violence that gradually brought the massive aircraft to a stop. She stopped with less than 20 meters of runway remaining. Esther sat in the pilot's seat for a moment, her hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline, processing what she'd just accomplished. The landing that her colleagues had declared impossible was complete, achieved through the same precise control that they'd criticized as weakness. Dr. Dubois's voice crackled through the radio, filled with relief and disbelief. British aircraft. That was ... extraordinary. We're bringing patients to the aircraft immediately. Through the cockpit windows, Esther could see medical personnel approaching with stretchers and wheelchairs, carrying the refugees who would have died without her intervention. Children, elderly adults, families devastated by disease. But now, with hope for recovery, the patient loading process took 45 minutes. Each refugee was carefully positioned in the aircraft's cargo area, which had been configured for medical transport. Dr. Dubois accompanied the group, providing medical care during the flight and serving as translator for passengers who spoke only Arabic or French. As the loading neared completion, Esther began her most challenging calculation: takeoff performance. From a 200-meter strip with 67 additional passengers and medical equipment. The weight was manageable, but the distance was at the absolute limit of possibility. She computed takeoff speed, acceleration distance, and obstacle clearance with mathematical precision. The margins were thin, perhaps 10 meters of runway, beyond the minimum required distance, but the physics supported success if everything went perfectly. Dr. Dubois, please ensure all passengers are secured. Takeoff will be ... dramatic. The takeoff run began with engines at maximum power, the aircraft accelerating more slowly than normal due to the rough surface and additional weight. Esther monitored speed with intense focus, knowing that premature rotation would prevent the aircraft from achieving flying speed. While delayed rotation would consume runway, they couldn't spare. At exactly 130 knots, she pulled back on the controls, lifting the C-17 into the air with perhaps 15 meters of runway remaining. The aircraft climbed slowly but steadily, clearing the obstacles beyond the strip with margins that would have horrified any conventional pilot but satisfied Esther's precise calculations. Behind her in the cargo area, 67 people were breathing easily for the first time in days, alive because someone had refused to accept the limitations that others had placed on what was possible. The flight to N'Djamena Hospital took 2 hours, during which Dr. Dubois worked tirelessly to stabilize the most critical patients, while Esther maintained contact with medical facilities to ensure immediate treatment would be available upon arrival. But even as she focused on the humanitarian mission, Esther knew that her unauthorized flight had triggered a massive response back at RAF Brampton. Her radio monitoring equipment picked up increasing traffic as Base Command coordinated with international aviation authorities to track her position and determine her intentions. Ascot 457, this is RAF Brampton Command, came a transmission from Wing Commander Mitchell. You are ordered to proceed directly to the nearest NATO airbase for immediate detention and investigation. RAF Brampton, this is Ascot 457, Esther responded. I am proceeding to N'Djamena International Airport to deliver 67 medical evacuation patients to hospital care. Mission will be complete in approximately 1 hour. Captain Baker, you are in violation of multiple international aviation regulations and military protocols. Your actions constitute theft of military aircraft and unauthorized international operations. Dr. Dubois, who had been listening to the radio exchange, approached the cockpit. Captain, are you in serious trouble because of this flight? Esther considered the question carefully. Dr. Dubois, I'll face severe consequences for my actions. But 67 people are alive who wouldn't have been otherwise. I can accept whatever punishment comes from that. The approach to N'Djamena International was routine compared to the refugee camp landing, though Esther found herself oddly nostalgic for the challenge of the short strip. Normal airports felt almost boring after proving that a C-17 could operate. From what amounted to a large parking lot, medical teams were waiting at the airport, alerted by Dr. Dubois during the flight. The patient transfer proceeded with efficient professionalism. Each refugee carefully moved to waiting ambulances for transport to the hospital. As the last patient was loaded into an ambulance, Dr. Dubois returned to thank Esther personally. Captain, what you did today was miraculous. Those people have a chance at life because you refused to accept that helping them was impossible. I just used the skills I'd trained for, Dr. Dubois. The real heroes are the medical personnel who will treat these patients. No, Dr. Dubois said firmly. The hero is the pilot who looked at a 200-meter dirt strip and said, I can land there. Your colleagues saw limitations. You saw possibilities. As Esther completed post-flight procedures and prepared to face whatever consequences awaited her, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Every criticism of her flying style, every exclusion from challenging missions, every suggestion that she was too gentle for demanding operations, all of it had been proven wrong by a single flight that demonstrated the value of precision over force. Her radio crackled with another transmission from RAF Brampton, but this time the voice was different. Ascot 457, this is Air Vice Marshal Thompson. You are ordered to remain in N'Djamena pending arrival of investigation team. Do not attempt to return to UK without authorization. Esther acknowledged the transmission and shut down the aircraft systems. Her military career was probably over, but 67 people were alive. The mathematics of that equation seemed clear to her. Even if it wouldn't be clear to the court, martial board she would inevitably face. Local airport authorities approached with questions about her unauthorized arrival, but international humanitarian protocols provided some protection for medical evacuation flights. She would be detained pending investigation, but not immediately arrested. As she was escorted to the airport administration building, Esther looked back at the C-17 sitting on the tarmac. The aircraft showed no signs of stress from its extreme short field operations, proving that her calculations had been conservative and her technique sound. She'd accomplished something that experienced pilots had declared impossible. using skills that had been dismissed as inadequate for real-world operations. The gentle touch that her colleagues had criticized had enabled her to land and take off from a strip that conventional flying would have avoided entirely. Her phone buzzed with messages from news organizations who had somehow learned about the unauthorized rescue mission. The story was spreading internationally. A young RAF pilot who had stolen a military transport aircraft to save refugees that everyone else had written off as unreachable. But Esther wasn't thinking about media attention or public recognition. She was thinking about a conversation with Squadron Leader Webb, where she'd been told that military aviation required proven procedures, not experimental techniques. Today, she'd proven that sometimes the procedures needed to be rewritten by people willing to push beyond conventional limitations. 3 weeks later, Esther stood outside Air Vice Marshal Thompson's office at RAF High Wycombe, her dress uniform crisp despite the uncertainty that had dominated every day since her unauthorized mission to Chad. The investigation had been thorough, involving interviews with dozens of personnel, analysis of flight data, and detailed review of her actions. The media attention had been overwhelming. International news organizations had covered the story of the rebel RAF pilot who had stolen a military aircraft to save refugees. Dr. Dubois had given interviews describing the impossible landing and takeoff, while aviation experts debated whether such operations were actually feasible. What surprised Esther most was the support she'd received from unexpected sources. Retired military pilots, civilian aviation professionals, and humanitarian organizations had publicly defended her actions. Several former RAF commanders had written to aviation publications explaining that exceptional circumstances sometimes required exceptional responses. Captain Baker, Thompson's aide, announced, "The Air Vice Marshal will see you now." Esther entered the office to find Thompson seated behind his desk with her complete service record and investigation results spread before him. Also present were Wing Commander Mitchell, Squadron Leader Webb, and 2 officers she didn't recognize from RAF Legal Services. "Captain Baker," Thompson began, "your unauthorized flight to Chad has created a significant problem for RAF Command. You violated multiple regulations, ignored direct orders, and operated outside your authority in ways that could have resulted in international incidents." "Yes, sir," Esther replied, maintaining her position at attention. "However," Thompson continued, "your actions also saved 67 lives and demonstrated flying capabilities that have impressed aviation professionals worldwide. The question we face is whether you're a disciplinary problem or an exceptional pilot whose talents have been improperly utilized." One of the legal officers leaned forward. "Captain, can you explain why you felt authorized to ignore direct orders and steal military aircraft?" Esther had rehearsed this answer many times during the investigation. "Sir, I believe that the value of saving 67 lives outweighed the importance of following procedures that would have resulted in their deaths. I had the skills necessary to accomplish the mission, and I accepted personal responsibility for the consequences." Thompson studied her with an expression that revealed nothing about his conclusions. "Captain, your technical assessment of the landing requirements proved accurate. Post-mission analysis confirms that your calculations were conservative and your techniques were sound. The question is whether your decision-making process can be trusted in future situations." Webb spoke for the first time since Esther had entered the office. "Sir, Captain Baker has always been technically proficient, but this incident demonstrates a concerning disregard for authority and established procedures." "Actually," Thompson replied, "this incident demonstrates exactly the kind of initiative and skill that the RAF needs in complex operational environments. Captain Baker identified a mission that others deemed impossible, developed the techniques necessary to accomplish it, and executed it flawlessly under extreme pressure." Wing Commander Mitchell consulted her notes. "Sir, there are still concerns. About Captain Baker's willingness to follow orders when she disagrees with command decisions. There are also concerns, Thompson countered, about command decisions that fail to utilize available capabilities effectively. Captain Baker's extensive training and preparation were dismissed rather than evaluated properly. The conversation continued for several more minutes, but Esther could sense that a decision had already been made. Thompson's questions focused more on her future potential than on her past violations. "Captain Baker," Thompson said finally, "you're being transferred immediately to the RAF Special Operations Squadron. Your new role will involve exactly the kind of challenging missions that require the skills you've demonstrated." Esther blinked, unsure she'd heard correctly. "Sir, you've proven that you can accomplish missions others consider impossible. We need pilots with that capability for operations where conventional approaches aren't sufficient." One of the legal officers added, "The unauthorized nature of your Chad mission will remain in your service record, but it will be accompanied by commendations for exceptional flying skill and humanitarian service." Thompson stood, extending his hand to Esther. "Captain, the RAF made a mistake in not recognizing your capabilities earlier. Your new assignment will ensure that doesn't happen again." As Esther left the office, she reflected on the transformation that had occurred. 3 weeks ago, she'd been an overlooked logistics pilot whose gentle flying style was considered inadequate for challenging operations. Today, she was being assigned to the most demanding missions in RAF service, her unauthorized flight to Chad had become legendary within aviation circles. Flight training programs were studying her techniques, and aircraft manufacturers were analyzing her performance data to understand short-field capabilities they hadn't previously recognized. Most importantly, the conversation about what was possible in aviation had fundamentally changed. Her gentle touch, once criticized as weakness, was now recognized as advanced technique that enabled operations others couldn't attempt. 6 months later, Captain Esther Baker stood in the same briefing room, where she'd once been assigned to routine training flights, but everything had changed. The patch on her shoulder indicated Special Operations Squadron, and when she spoke, people listened with the respect accorded to someone who had proven that limitations existed more in minds than in reality. "The terrain in the target area is challenging but manageable," she told the assembled Special Operations team, pointing to reconnaissance photographs of another remote airstrip. "The key is energy management and understanding exactly what the aircraft can accomplish with proper technique." Her colleague, Flight Lieutenant Sarah Chun, nodded approvingly. "How long for the approach and landing?" 45 minutes to establish the approach parameters, then a precision landing that will place us exactly where the ground team needs us," Esther replied. "The strip is longer than Chad, so we'll have comfortable margins." As the team prepared for deployment, Esther thought about the journey that had brought her here. She'd gone from being told her flying was too soft to leading the RAV's most challenging missions, proving that sometimes the gentlest touch could accomplish the impossible. The morning sun streaming through the briefing room windows reminded her of that dawn over the African desert when she'd approached a landing that everyone said was impossible. Today would bring another mission, another opportunity to prove that exceptional situations required exceptional responses. But more than that, she'd changed how the RAF thought about pilot capabilities and mission possibilities. Her unauthorized rescue had created ripples that extended far beyond that single flight, inspiring a new generation of pilots to push beyond conventional limitations. As her team walked toward the aircraft, Esther smiled at the irony. She'd finally achieved everything she'd dreamed of in her military career, but only after nearly ending that career by refusing to accept the limitations others had placed on her potential. The aircraft waited on the tarmac, ready for another mission that would have been declared impossible just months ago. Esther approached it with the same confidence she'd felt that morning in Chad. knowing that her gentle touch and precise control could take them anywhere they needed to go. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. This one hit the mark. You won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.